Chapter 23 of Abraham Lincoln: A History, Volume 4. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln: A History, Volume 4, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 23, Fremont. Missouri had been saved from organized rebellion, but the smell and blackness of insurrectionary fire was strong upon her. While Governor Jackson and General Price, flying from the battle of Boonville as fugitives, were momentarily helpless, they nevertheless had reasonable hope of quick support. Military preparation was set in motion by the Governor's proclamation of June 12th, and his order dividing the State into 9 military districts, and issuing commissions to a skeleton army under the provisions of the military bill passed by his rebel legislature before their expulsion from the capital by Lyon. Thus everyone inclined to take up arms against the Union had the plausible excuse of authority and the guidance of a designated commander and rendezvous, and a simultaneous movement toward organization long preconcerted immediately began. Missouri is a large state. She had over 68,000 square miles of territory and a population of over 1,000,000 souls. A trifling percentage would yield a formidable force. The spirit and impulse of revolution were at fever heat, and all the fire of the border ruffian days smoldered along the frontier. The Governor's brigadier generals designated camps, and the hot-blooded country lads flocked to them, finding a charm of adventure in the very privations they were compelled to undergo. For half a year disloyalty had gone unpunished. The recent reports of march and battle served rather to sharpen their zeal. 3 railroads radiated from St. Louis, one towards the west with its terminus at Sedalia, one towards the southwest, ending at Rolla, one towards the south, which terminated near Ironton. The first of these reached only about 3/4, the last 2 scarcely halfway across the State. Western Missouri, therefore, seemed beyond any quick reach of a military expedition from St. Louis. General Price, going westward from Boonville, found one of these camps at Lexington. Governor Jackson, proceeding southward, was attended by a little remnant of fugitives from the battle of Boonville. With such following as each could gather, both directed their course toward the Arkansas line, collecting adherents as they went. Their pathway was not entirely clear. Before leaving St. Louis, Lyon had sent an expedition, numbering about 2,500, commanded by Thomas W. Sweeney, a captain of regulars, by rail to Rolla, and thence by a week's march to Springfield, from which point he had advanced a part of his force under Colonel Franz Sigel to Carthage, near the extreme southwestern corner of the State. Jackson and Price, having previously united their forces, thus found Sigel directly in their path. As they greatly outnumbered him, by the Battle of Carthage, June 5th, a sharp but decisive engagement, they drove him back upon Springfield, and effected a junction with the rebel force gathered in the northwestern corner of Arkansas, which had already assisted them by demonstrations and by capturing one of Sigel's companies. Delayed by the need of transportation, Lyon could not start from Boonville on his southwestern march until the 3rd of July. The improvised forces of Jackson and Price, moving rapidly because made up largely of cavalry, or rather unorganized horsemen, were far in advance, and had overwhelmed Sigel before Lyon was well on his way. Nevertheless, he pushed ahead with energy, having called to him a detachment of regulars from Fort Leavenworth and volunteers from Kansas, numbering about 2,200. These increased his column to about 4,600 men. By July 13th he was at Springfield, and with the forces he found there was at the head of an aggregate of between 7,000 and 8,000 troops. The Confederate authorities had ambitious plans for the West. They already possessed Arkansas, the Indian Territory was virtually in their grasp, Missouri they looked upon with confident eyes, even the ultimate conquest of Kansas seemed more than a remote possibility. Nor were such plans confined to mere speculation. Major General Leonidas Polk was stationed at Memphis early in July to command the Mississippi region. The neutrality policy in Kentucky for the moment left the Tennessee contingent idle. Being appealed to by Governor Jackson, Polk made immediate preparations for a campaign in Missouri. On July 23 he reported to the Confederate government his purpose to send two strong columns into that State, one under General Ben McCulloch of about 25,000 men against Lyon at Springfield, another under Generals Gideon J. Pillow and William J. Hardee to march upon Ironton in southeast Missouri, where he estimated they would collect a force of 18,000. He wrote, quote, "They are directed to pass in behind Lyon's force by land, or to proceed to St. Louis, seize it, and taking possession of the boats at that point, to proceed up the river Missouri, raising the Missourians as they go, and at such point as may appear most suitable to detach a force, to cut off Lyon's retreat from the west. If, as I think, I can drive the enemy from Missouri with the force indicated, I will then enter Illinois and take Cairo in the rear on my return." He was obliged a few days later to curtail this extravagant program. Governor Jackson, he learned, to his chagrin, had exaggerated the available forces fully one half. Although he had already sent Pillow to New Madrid, he now paused in the execution of his plan, and the rivalry of the various rebel commanders seems soon to have completely paralyzed it. The "neutrality" attitude of the governors of both Missouri and Kentucky greatly delayed the progress of the war in the West. The middle of June came before Lyon chased the rebels from Jefferson City, and in Kentucky open and positive military action was deferred till the first week of September. Meanwhile, it was felt that the beginning of serious hostilities was only a question of time. The Mississippi River was blockaded by rebels, commerce suspended, Cairo garrisoned and fortified by Union forces, gunboats were being built, regiments were being organized and sent hither and thither, mainly as yet to keep the neighborhood peace. In the East, the several Virginia campaigns were in progress, and General Scott's Anaconda plan was well understood in confidential circles. This condition of affairs made the whole Mississippi Valley sensitive and restless. The governors of the Northwest met, and by memorial and delegation urged the administration to make the Ohio line secure by moving forward and occupying advanced posts in Kentucky and Tennessee. Especially did they urge the appointment of a competent commander who might organize the immense resources of the West and make them effective in a grand campaign southward to open the Mississippi. Almost universal public sentiment turned to John C. Fremont as the desired leader for this duty. He was about 48 years of age. As student, as explorer, as a prominent actor in making California a State of the Union, he had shown talent and energy, and conquered success in situations of hazard and peril. As senator for a brief term, his votes proved that the North could rely on his convictions and principles. As presidential candidate of the Republican Party in 1856, his name had broadened into national representative value. The post of honor then had brought him defeat. He might well claim the post of duty for a chance to win a victory. The dash of romance in his career easily rekindled popular enthusiasm. Political sagacity indicated that he should be encouraged to change this popularity into armies and lead them to military success in aid of the imperiled nation. The inclination of the administration coincided with the sentiment of the people. Seward had proposed him for Secretary of War, and Lincoln mentioned him for the French mission. But in the recent distribution of offices, no place, at once suitable to his abilities and adequate to his claims, had been found available. This new crisis seemed to have carved out the work for the man. He had passed the previous winter in France, but upon the outbreak of rebellion returned to his country. On his arrival in the city of New York, about the 1st of July, President Lincoln appointed him a major general in the regular army, and on the 3d created the Western Department, consisting of the State of Illinois and all the states and territories between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, and placed it under his command, with headquarters at St. Louis. For a man whose genius could have risen to the requirements of the occasion, it was a magnificent opportunity, an imperial theater. Unfortunately, the country and the administration had overrated Fremont's abilities. Instead of proceeding at once to his post of duty, he remained in New York, absorbed largely in his personal affairs. 2 weeks passed before he sent his letter of acceptance and oath of office. "Please proceed to your command without coming here," telegraphed General Scott 2 days later. Postmaster General Blair testified, quote, "As soon as he was appointed, I urged him to go to his department. The President questioned me every day about his movements. I told him so often that Fremont was off, or was going the next day, according to my information, that I felt mortified when allusion was made to it, and dreaded a reference to the subject. Finally, on the receipt of a dispatch from Lyon by my brother, describing the condition of his command, I felt justified in telegraphing General Fremont that he must go at once. But he remained till after Bull Run, and even then, when he should have known the inspiration that would give the rebels, he traveled leisurely to St. Louis." When on July 25th he reached his headquarters and formally assumed command, he did not find his new charge a bed of roses. The splendid military strength of the Northwest was only beginning to be developed. Recruiting offices were full, but commanders of departments and governors of states quarreled over the driblets of arms and equipments remaining in the arsenals, and which were needed in a dozen places at once. The educated and experienced officers and subalterns of the old regular army, familiar with organization and routine, did not suffice to furnish the needed brigadier generals and colonels, much less adjutants, commissaries, quartermasters, and drill sergeants. Error, extravagance, delay, and waste ensued. Regiments were rushed off to the front without uniforms, arms, or rations, sometimes without being mustered into service. Yet the latent resources were abundant in quantity and excellent in quality, and especially in the qualities of mind, ambition, earnestness, and talent competent through practical service to rise to every requirement of duty and sacrifice. Genius which could lead, and patriotic devotion ready to serve, suffer, and die. What magnificent capabilities in those early Western volunteers! What illustrious talent in those first regiments, found by Fremont and coming at his call! Lyon, Grant, Blair, McClernand, Pope, Logan, Schofield, Curtis, Sturgis, Palmer, Hurlbut, and 100 others whose names shine on the records of war, to say nothing of the thousands who, unheralded, went gloriously to manful duty and patriotic death. The 3 weeks loitered away in New York already served to quadruple Fremont's immediate task. Lyon had taken the field, and Blair had gone to Washington to take his seat in the special session of Congress as a representative. The whole service immediately felt the absence from headquarters of these two inspiring and guiding leaders. At 3 points in Fremont's new department, matters wore a threatening aspect. Following the Battle of Boonville, there broke out in many parts of the state a destructive guerrilla warfare, degenerating into neighborhood and family feuds, and bloody personal reprisal and revenge, which became known under the term of bushwhacking. Houses and bridges were burned, farms were plundered, railroads were obstructed and broken, men were kidnapped and assassinated. During the whole period of the war, few organized campaigns disturbed the large territory of the state, but disorder, lawlessness, crime, and almost anarchy were with difficulty repressed from beginning to end. The local administration, charged with the eradication of these evils, was greatly embarrassed and often thwarted through the unfortunate jealousy and rivalry between the factions of radicals and conservatives, both adherents of the Union. Equally loyal, equally sincere in their devotion to the government, they paralyzed each other's efforts by a blind opposition and recrimination. As events progressed, these factions increased in their animosity towards each other, and their antagonistic attitude was continued throughout the whole war period. This conflict of public sentiment, personal, political, and military, produced no end of complications, requiring the repeated direct interference of President Lincoln, and taxed to the utmost his abounding forbearance. Neighborhood troubles were growing in northern Missouri before Fremont left New York, and Lyon's adjutant selected Brigadier General John Pope to take command there and restore order. Fremont gave his permission by telegraph, and when he reached St. Louis, General Pope had 8 Illinois regiments employed in this duty. General Pope, under date of August 3rd, gave a graphic description of the proceedings and methods of the bushwhackers. The only persons in arms, so far as I could learn, were a few reckless and violent men in parties of 20 or 30, who were wandering about committing depredations upon all whose sentiments were displeasing, and keeping this whole region in apprehension and uneasiness. So soon as these marauders found that troops were approaching, which they easily did from the very persons who asked for protection, they dispersed, each man going to his home, and in many cases that home in the very town occupied by the troops. When troops were sent out against these marauders, they found only men quietly working in the field or sitting in their offices, who, as soon as the backs of the Federal soldiers were turned, were again in arms and menacing the peace." Pope to Sturgeon, August 3, 1861. Fremont's second point of difficulty was the strong report of danger to Cairo. The rebel General Polk, at Memphis, was in the midst of preparations for his Missouri campaign, already mentioned. About the time of Fremont's arrival, Pillow had just moved 6,000 Tennesseans to New Madrid, and reported his whole force, "full of enthusiasm and eager for the Dutch hunt." News of this movement, and the brood of wild rumors which it engendered, made General Benjamin M. Prentiss, the Union commander at Cairo, exceedingly uneasy, and he called urgently for assistance. Cairo, the strategic key of the whole Mississippi Valley, was too important to be for a moment neglected, and in a few days after his arrival Fremont gathered the nearest available reinforcements, about 8 regiments in all, and loading them on a fleet of steamboats, led them in person in a somewhat ostentatious expedition to Cairo. And the demonstration, greatly magnified by rumor, doubtless had much influence in checking the hopes of the rebel commanders for an early capture of Missouri and Illinois. The reinforcement of Cairo was very proper as a measure of precaution. It turned out, however, that the need was less urgent than Fremont's third point of trouble, namely, the safety of Lyon at Springfield, in southwestern Missouri. When Lyon left St. Louis, he had conceived this campaign to the southwest, not merely to control that part of the State and to protect it against invasion, but also with the ultimate hope of extending his march into Arkansas. For this, he knew his force in hand was inadequate, but he believed that from the troops being rapidly organized in the contiguous free States, he would receive the necessary help as soon as it was needed. We have seen that he reached Springfield with an aggregate of about 7,000 or 8,000 men. It was, for those early days, a substantial, compact little army, well commanded, self-reliant, and enthusiastic. Unfortunately, also, like the armies at every other point, it was under the strain and discouragement of partial dissolution. The term of enlistment of the 3 months' militia regiments, raised under the President's first proclamation, was about to expire. In every detachment and army, and at every post throughout the whole country, there occurred about the middle of July, 1861, the incident of a rapid succession of companies and regiments going out of the service. Many of these corps immediately reorganized under the 3 years' call, many remained temporarily in the field to take part in some impending battle, but despite such instances of generous patriotism, there was at all points a shrinkage of numbers, an interval of disorganization, a paralysis of action and movement. On the whole, therefore, Lyon found his new position at Springfield discouraging. It was 120 miles from a railroad, provisions and supplies had not arrived as expected, half his army would in a brief period be mustered out of service, McClellan was in Western Virginia, Fremont in New York, Frank P. Blair, Jr. in Washington. While McClellan was yet at Cincinnati organizing the Ohio contingent of 3 months' men, Missouri had been temporarily attached to his department. Beyond a few suggestions, by telegraph, however, he did not give it any attention in detail, because his hands were already full of work. His Virginia campaign soon required his presence and entire time. He scarcely knew who commanded or where to turn. The rebels were in formidable force just beyond the Arkansas line. The dispatches at this juncture take on an almost despairing tone. All idea of any further advance movement, or even of maintaining our present position, must soon be abandoned, unless the Government furnishes us promptly with large reinforcements and supplies. Our troops are badly clothed, poorly fed, and imperfectly supplied with tents. None of them have as yet been paid." 2 days later, Lyon wrote, "If it is the intention to give up the West, let it be so. It can only be the victim of imbecility or malice. Scott will cripple us if he can. Cannot you stir up this matter and secure us relief? See Fremont if he has arrived. The want of supplies has crippled me so that I cannot move, and I do not know when I can. Everything seems to combine against me at this point. Stir up Blair." Lyon's innuendos against the administration and against General Scott were alike unjust. Both were eager to aid him, but there was here, as elsewhere, a limit to possibilities. It was Fremont who needed stirring up. Appointed by the President on July 1st, he had not even sent his official acceptance till the 16th, the day before Lyon wrote this appeal, and in spite of emphatic urging by Postmaster General Blair, it was the 25th before he entered on his duties at St. Louis. 3 special messengers from Lyon awaited him on his arrival, and repeated the tale of need and of danger. But Fremont responded feebly. Urgent calls, indeed, came to him from other quarters. As already stated, Cairo was represented to be seriously threatened, and he had chosen first to ensure its safety. He had the means, by a judicious rearrangement of his forces, to have aided effectually both these exposed points. Under the critical conditions fully pointed out to him, he could at least have recalled Lyon and assisted his safe withdrawal to his railroad base at Rolla. But he neither recalled him nor substantially reinforced him. 2 regiments were set in motion towards him, but it proved the merest feint of help. No supplies and no troops reached Lyon in season to be of the slightest service. His danger lay in a junction of the various rebel leaders just beyond the Arkansas line. The Confederate government had sent Brigadier General McCulloch to conciliate or conquer the Indian Territory, as events might dictate, and had given him 3 regiments, one from Louisiana, one from Texas, and one from Arkansas, for the work. Finding it bad policy for the present to occupy the Indian Territory, he hovered about the border with permission to move into either Kansas or Missouri. Even before Polk's ambitious program was found to be impracticable, McCulloch made haste to organize a campaign on his own account. On July 30th, he reported that he was on his way towards Springfield with his own brigade of 3,200 troops, the command of General N.B. Pierce, with 2,500 Arkansas State troops, and the heterogeneous gathering of Missourians under General Sterling Price, which he thought could furnish about 7,000 effective men, generally well mounted but badly commanded, and armed only with common rifles and shotguns. It was the approach of this large force which had given Lyon such uneasiness, and with good cause. Moving steadily upon him, they soon approached so near that his position became critical. His own command had dwindled to less than 5,000 effective men, the combined enemy had nearly treble that number of effectives, and probably more than 3 to 1, counting the whole mass. If he remained stationary, they would slowly envelop and capture him. If he attempted to retreat through the 120 miles of barren mountainous country which lay between him and Rolla, they would follow and harass him, and turn his retreat into a rout. Counting to the last upon reinforcements which did not come, he had allowed events to place him in an untenable position. As a final and desperate resource, and the only one to save his army, he resolved to attack and cripple the enemy. As at Bull Run, and as so often happens, each army on the evening of August 9th was under orders to advance that night and attack the other. Showers of rain in the evening caused McCulloch temporarily to suspend his order, but Lyon's little army, moving at nightfall, marched 10 miles south of Springfield to Wilson's Creek. At midnight they halted for a brief bivouac. Dividing into 2 columns, they fell upon the enemy's camp at daylight, Sigel with 1,200 men in a battery, marching against their right flank in an endeavor to get to the rear, while Lyon in person led the remaining 3,700 men, with 2 batteries, to a front attack against their left center. The movement was a most daring one, and the conflict soon became desperate. Sigel's attack, successful at first, was checked, his detachment put to flight, and 5 of his 6 guns captured and turned against Lyon. Lyon, on the contrary, by an impetuous advance, not only quickly drove the enemy out of their camp, but gained and occupied a strong natural position, which he held with brave determination. His mixed force of regulars and volunteers fought with admirable cooperation. McCulloch, confident in his overwhelming numbers, sent forward line after line of attack, which Lyon's well-posted regular batteries threw back. About the middle of the forenoon, an unusually heavy assault from the enemy was thus repulsed, largely by help of the inspiriting personal example of Lyon, who led some fragments of reserves in a bayonet charge, but who fell, pierced by a ball, and almost immediately expired. It was his fourth wound received in the action. The command devolved upon Samuel D. Sturgis, a major of regulars commanding a brigade, and the battle continued until about noon, though no new movements were made. The rebels at length retired, but it was deemed too hazardous to attempt to hold the field, and a retreat to Springfield was agreed upon by a council of the officers. An unmolested withdrawal was effected in the afternoon, and upon further consultation, a definite retreat upon Rolla was begun the following day. As Lyon had anticipated, the enemy was too much crippled to follow. The Union forces had 223 killed, 721 wounded, and 291 missing. The Confederate loss was 265 killed, 800 wounded, and 30 missing. The Battle of Wilson's Creek, the death of Lyon, and the retreat of the army to Rolla turned public attention and criticism sharply upon Fremont's department and administration, and that commander was suddenly awakened to his work and responsibility. He now made haste to dispatch reinforcements to Rolla and sent urgent telegrams for help to Washington and to the governors of the neighboring free States. He declared martial law in the city of St. Louis, and began an extensive system of fortifications, which, together with directions to fortify Rolla, Jefferson City, and several other places, pointed so much to inaction and a defensive policy as to increase rather than allay public murmur. Grave dissatisfaction arose from his defects of administration. Instead of bringing order to the chaotic condition of military business, he was prone to set method and routine at defiance, issuing commissions and directing the giving out of contracts in so irregular a way as to bring a protest from the proper accounting officers of the government. Though specially requested by the President to cooperate with the provisional governor, he continued to ignore him. A storm of complaint soon arose from all except the little knot of flatterers who abused his favor and the newspapers that were thriving on his patronage. The Unionists of Missouri became afraid that he was neglecting the present safety of the State for the future success of his intended Mississippi expedition, and wild rumors even floated in the air of a secret purpose to imitate the scheme of Aaron Burr and set up an independent dictatorship in the West. Reports came to President Lincoln from multiplied sources, bringing him a flood of embarrassment from the man to whom he had looked with such confidence for administrative aid and military success. It was his uniform habit, when he had once confided command and responsibility to an individual, to sustain him in the trust to the last possible degree. While he heard with pain the accumulating evidence of Fremont's unfitness, instead of immediately removing him from command, he sought rather to remedy the defect. In this spirit he wrote the following letter to General David Hunter, which letter peculiarly illustrates his delicacy in managing the susceptibilities of men. Quote, "My dear Sir, General Fremont needs assistance which it is difficult to give him. He is losing the confidence of men near him, whose support any man in his position must have to be successful. His cardinal mistake is that he isolates himself, and allows nobody to see him, and by which he does not know what is going on in the very matter he is dealing with. He needs to have by his side a man of large experience. Will you not, for me, take that place? Your rank is one grade too high to be ordered to it, but will you not serve the country and oblige me by taking it voluntarily?" End quote. With this letter of the President, Postmaster General Blair, hitherto Fremont's warm personal friend, and Montgomery C. Meigs, the Quartermaster General of the Army, went to St. Louis to make a brief inspection and report on matters, and to give friendly advice and admonition to the commander of the Department of the West. While they were on their way, Mrs. Fremont was journeying towards Washington, bearing her husband's reply to a letter from the President sent him by a special messenger about a week before. Her mind was less occupied with the subject of the missive she bore than with a recent quarrel which the general had imprudently allowed to grow up between Colonel Blair and himself. Blair had finally become convinced of Fremont's incapacity, and in public print sharply criticized his doings. Indeed, the quarrel soon progressed so far that Fremont placed him under arrest. Then Blair preferred formal charges against the general for maladministration, and the general, in turn, entered formal countercharges against Blair. Arrived at her destination, Mrs. Fremont took the opportunity, in her interview with Mr. Lincoln, to justify General Fremont in all he had done, and to denounce his accusers with impetuous earnestness. She even asked for copies of confidential letters about her husband's personal embroilment. In these circumstances, it was no light task for Mr. Lincoln to be at once patient, polite, and just. Yet the following letter will testify that he accomplished even this difficult feat. Washington, D.C., September 12, 1861. Mrs. General Fremont. My dear Madam, your two notes of today are before me. I answered the letter you bore me from General Fremont on yesterday, and not hearing from you during the day, I sent the answer to him by mail. It is not exactly correct, as you say you were told by the elder Mr. Blair, to say that I sent Postmaster General Blair to St. Louis to examine into that department and report. Postmaster General Blair did go, with my approbation, to see and converse with General Fremont as a friend. I do not feel authorized to furnish you with copies of letters in my possession without the consent of the writers. No impression has been made on my mind against the honor or integrity of General Fremont, and I now enter my protest against being understood as acting in any hostility towards him. Your obedient servant, A. Lincoln. It will be interesting to read, in addition, a graphic verbal recapitulation of these incidents, made by President Lincoln in a confidential evening conversation with a few friends in the Executive Office a little more than 2 years afterward, and which one of his secretaries recorded. The Blairs have to an unusual degree the spirit of clan. Their family is a close corporation. Frank is their hope and pride. They have a way of going with a rush for anything they undertake. Especially have Montgomery and the old gentleman. When this war first began, they could think of nothing but Fremont. They expected everything from him, and upon their urgent solicitation, he was made a general and sent to Missouri. I thought well of Fremont. Even now I think well of his impulses. I only think he is the prey of wicked and designing men, and I think he has absolutely no military capacity. He went to Missouri the pet and protege of the Blairs. At first they corresponded with him and with Frank, who was with him, fully and confidentially, thinking his plans and his effort would accomplish great things for the country. At last the tone of Frank's letters changed. It was a change from confidence to doubt and uncertainty. They were pervaded with a tone of sincere sorrow and fear that Fremont would fail. Montgomery showed them to me, and we were both grieved at the prospect. Soon came the news that Fremont had issued his emancipation order and had set up a Bureau of Abolition, giving free papers, and occupying his time apparently with little else. At last, at my suggestion, Montgomery Blair went to Missouri to look at and talk over matters. He went as the friend of Fremont. He passed, on the way, Mrs. Fremont coming to see me. She sought an audience with me at midnight, and taxed me so violently with many things that I had to exercise all the awkward tact I have to avoid quarreling with her. She surprised me by asking why their enemy, Montgomery Blair, had been sent to Missouri. She more than once intimated that if General Fremont should decide to try the conclusions with me, he could set up for himself. End of chapter 23. Recording by Owen Cook in Potawatomi Ceded Land.